Number 1. So when I was 14 years old, I lived in this small town that didn't really have anything special. You see, most days I'd hang out with a group of friends, whether it be outside or at somebody else's house. Well, one of those days, me and three of my friends went to my main friend's house to watch a movie or something like that. And as more time had passed, more friends had gone home. Because my parents were always very laid back, and our town was small, they let me stay out as late as I wanted, as long as I answered their calls. So eventually, me and my main friend are the only people left, and we were both starting to get tired, so I told him that I was leaving. So I leave his house, and I start going home. On my way there, I take out my phone to plug in my headphones, and start to listen to music to pass the time. Keep in mind that because my sound was above 70%, I could barely hear anything. So about halfway home, as I'm walking, all of a sudden, a car pulls up next to me very quickly. I noticed that there were 3 men, 2 in the front and 1 in the back. At this point I was panicking and contemplating running, but instead I just froze out of fear. That's when one of the guys looks at me and says, "Hey there, little girl. I just wanted to tell you that there is a man right behind you." Now, after I comprehended what he just told me, I felt my heart skip a beat, and I started to get shaky. They said that they were driving when they noticed the man behind me. So that's why they quickly drove towards me, as they told me the man ran off the second they saw them. After explaining what had happened, they offered me a ride home. Now, me still being scared, I declined. They understood, and instead said they would just drive behind me while I walk home. After reaching home, they told my sister what had happened, and I never did tell my parents what happened. Since then, I've completely stopped listening to music while walking. Number 2. This happened to me not long ago. I'd say about a month or 2 now. It was a Saturday, and I decided to go on a walk, as I usually do this on weekends, since I live fairly close to a nice shopping center and park. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, since I didn't have money with me. So instead of going to the shopping center, I went to a small park-like area with a couple of benches. It's fenced in right above the parking lot for a city transit. Keep in mind, this park is fairly difficult to get to. There are only 2 entrances on either side, and the rest is covered with a chain fence. I chose to sit on the bench that allowed me clear view to both exits because I'm naturally a very paranoid person. I began listening to music and looking through Facebook for about 20 to 30 minutes. At that point, I noticed a car pull over by the side of the road, closest to the entrance to my right. It was a somewhat small black car with tinted windows. Obviously, I didn't think much of it at the time and continued browsing through my phone. Now would be a good time to mention that I'm a 16-year-old blonde girl, and creepers like this are nothing new to me. I look up about 5 minutes later and noticed nobody had exited the car. It was just sitting there, pulled over on a fairly busy road. Eventually, after a couple of cars began honking at it, the driver pulled back into the road and brought his car around the entrance, closest to my left side. This entrance was closest to the parking lot, which is rather big and not very occupied on Saturdays, considering most people park there to take the bus or even the train on work days. The car parks in the spot closest to the entrance on my left and begins acting very erratically. It whips into reverse, then back into forward, and parks continuously revving its engine. At this point, I'm starting to get scared, and I get up from the bench. I can't exit the park with the exit on my right because there isn't a sidewalk to walk on, so I'm forced to go past this creepy black car to escape. I power walk past him, and I look over and notice the man inside had rolled down his windows and began yelling very scary things. This man looked to be around 30 years old, white, and he had brown hair and sunglasses. I started to walk quicker, and this is when I began to panic. My friend who I was planning on meeting later that day was calling me, so I picked up and quickly began telling her the story. The man can now see what I was telling somebody on the phone, and he whipped out of the parking lot. Relieved, I figured he got scared I was calling the police and ended up leaving. I told my friend not to worry and that I'd see her later. I stopped for a minute in about the middle of the parking lot and tried to calm myself down. I put in my headphones and started listening to some music as I continued through the parking lot. After a few steps, I look over and see the same car, re-entering the parking lot like before. I'm starting to get scared at this point as I'm running towards the exit of the parking lot. That's when he notices me running and quickly pulls out of the parking lot and around to box me in. I hide behind a large gray car as he rolls by with his window down, clearly trying to find out where I went. After he passes, I sprint across the street and I go to the bus loop. I figure I might be able to get help. As I'm standing in the bus loop, searching for any possible saviors, the car drives by again. He didn't notice I left the parking lot, and thankfully, he didn't see me in the bus loop either. At this point, I realize there's nobody in sight to ask for help from, so I book it to the crossing lights, figuring the bookstore in the strip mall is my best bet at civilization. As I get to the crosswalk, the red light flashes, just my luck, and the black car rolls by and stops. I dialed my dad, because I wasn't sure if I should call the police or not at that point. My dad told me to get into the bookstore quickly and he'd come pick me up. The walk light began to flash, and as I was crossing the street, the car tries to hit me. It slams on the gas as soon as it's in front of me, but luckily, I managed to get past it just in time. I sprint into the bookstore and immediately informed one of the workers what was happening, and they dialed the police. The police came very quickly, thankfully, but the car was never found. Thankfully, I've yet to see this car again. However, I still get incredibly paranoid around black cars like that one. Number 3. Thought I would tell people a little bit of background information. I'm an avid mountain walker and spend most weekends trekking the mountains and hills of South Wales. I've done this for over 15 years, and within that time, only twice have I ever felt genuinely concerned for my safety. Once when I was confronted by a bull, and the other in the story below. It was a boiling hot Saturday afternoon, about 5 years ago. I was doing one of my favorite walks, which was about 14 miles long. This particular area was mainly forestry, but the tracks themselves were gravel. There were no other walkers and only a few cyclists, which kinda was typical because it was hot. So the first 9 or 10 miles were stranded. I was at the bottom of a track that would eventually lead to the top of the valley. About 50 meters ahead, I could see a man walking in the same direction. He was tall, thin, and had short cropped hair. He was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and black boots. Plus, he walked with a strange limp. It looked like he had to swing his legs around, almost like one was shorter than the other. I didn't think much of it. He was actually walking quite fast, so probably wouldn't have to overtake him. I carried on up the track, and the sun was overhead, and it was sweltering. The man in front kept limping along, but nonetheless was making quick work of the incline. The track started to bend, and I lost sight of the limping man. The track comes up to a choice of 2 paths. East that leads to a small car park that is rarely used, and west, which leads to the top of the valley. As I was about to head west, I heard a man shouting. It was coming from within the forest. I waited for a second, and then another outburst. My first thought was that, oh man, that guy must have tried taking a shortcut and had fallen over. As I made my way through the thick trees and ferns to see what was up, I stopped in my boots. Up ahead through the trees, I could see the man. He was sat down on a log with his head in his hands, and then he screamed at the top of his lungs. He then bolted up and started punching a tree. His face was bright red, and he was raging. He then picked up a stick and started to bash it against the tree. I was frozen. I couldn't actually process what was going on. He just looked absolutely mad. He then shouted,
"I hate you,"
and started stomping his feet. I simply thought, I need to get out of here before he sees me. I quietly started to make my way back to the track, careful not to fall over or to make any loud noise. That man was clearly a lunatic. I thought I would go the more rarely used east track, and then take a shortcut north through the ferns. This was probably the best way to avoid him. With every step I became more confident, and almost started to laugh about it. Maybe he wanted to let off a bit of steam and vent some anger. It was the middle of the forest anyways, so it was a perfect place to do it. After about 10 or 15 minutes, the ferns started to grow thick, and they were at chest level. It wasn't a problem because they are fairly easy to push through. As I looked back behind me, I could see the limping man about 25 meters away. He was now waddling through the ferns towards me. He had a strange snarl on his face, and his head is bobbing up and down. I couldn't believe what was happening. He must have seen me. There was no other explanation. I was only a mile away from the main road, so I started to speed up and walk a bit faster. I occasionally looked behind me and could see I was getting further and further away, and I started to relax. It was finally over, I told myself. I still don't know what to make of the situation, But the fact he followed me through the ferns was the most disturbing thing ever. I've done that same walk over a dozen times since, and haven't seen him again, and I hope I never do. Number 4. A little background before I get started. I live in an apartment complex who has a trash service that will come and pick up your trash every Sunday to Thursday. To be honest, they're quite terrible, but I suppose it's better than having to haul your trash out to the dumpster every other day. We're told to put it no later than 6 p.m. to guarantee that it gets picked up. However, it can get picked up anywhere between 6 p.m. and 1 a.m. the next day. I was having a movie night with some friends, and it was around 8:30 p.m. As they went to leave, I unlocked the door, but one friend forgot her purse on my table, and we waited for her to grab it before opening the door. As she's coming back, the door is open from the other side. As I was standing right by the door, it was stopped by my foot, and we're shocked to see what's on the other side. Then immediately afterwards, we hear somebody hauling down the hallway and down the staircase. I live on the 3rd floor, and unfortunately, I go and chase after the person, but he's already a floor below me, and I decide not to follow him any further than the staircase. I get his basic description: 6 foot, blonde, gray shirt under the yellow reflective vest that trash people use, and all that kind of thing. I figured he was one of their employees, so I called the cops and the trash company and let them know what happened. This all happened yesterday. Today, I was told by the trash company that none of their employees were on site at the time. They were just finishing picking up another complex's trash, a few streets over, and were on their way to get ours. The police also informed me that this isn't the first report they've gotten in my area regarding somebody who looks like the trash company's employees. It's just scary to think that somebody is going around impersonating a garbage man in an attempt to find some poor soul who's left their door unlocked and do who knows what to them. Remember everyone, please lock your doors, even when you're home alone. I personally have things to defend myself with, but that might not be the case with everybody. Please be careful out there. And to the guy impersonating the garbage man, let's not meet. Number 5. I was 16 at the time. My family lived in a typical Midwest subdivision in a large town. Our subdivision was on the corner of a busy road, and a not so busy road that eventually turns into a dirt road after a short distance. The other 2 sides of the subdivision is all woods. Now, that's important. Across the not so busy road is a trailer park that when we first moved out to this town, when I was 9 years old, there's this creep that lived right next to us. He sort of scared my family, as well as most of the families in our neighborhood. You see, my family had a house on the edge of the subdivision that the only thing that separated us from the trailer park was a grassy berm that wrapped around our subdivision. But we're also out in the middle of nowhere, and so there were no streetlights on that not-so-busy road. It was very dark at night. So, every night we would lock down our house. We would double-check all the deadbolts, bar our 2 big sliding glass doors and easily accessible windows, draw the sliding wooden blinds in front of those big glass doors. Pretty much things like that. That was the routine. I know it might seem like much, but my parents didn't want weapons inside the house, and we were on the outskirts of town. Plus, it would take a while for the police officer to respond. At the time this event occurred, we had 2 Jack Russell Terriers that always slept with my parents in their room, with the door closed. They would sleep in there every night, but not in this one. Our male Jack Russell, Jack, was known to be territorial and aggressive, but only if he was sleeping and you tried to move him. He never bit anybody, but he would snarl his teeth at you. That night, we were on the couch watching a movie in the living room. When we got up after the movie, he snapped at my mom and slightly nipped her finger. My mom was upset and put the dog in his crate. She was so mad that she left him down there when she went to bed. Well, one other thing that was out of place for the night. My mom also forgot to pull the big sliding wooden blinds that were in front of the big glass sliding doors. These doors lead to our back patio that faced the berm and the not-so-busy road. When we didn't have our light on, it was pitch black. Jack's crate was right in view of these windows. Everything seemed normal until 1 in the morning. At 1 a.m., we all woke up to Jack going berserk. Jack had a history of going nuts over other animals: cats, horses, birds, squirrels, etc. In fact, he almost injured one of our cats before, so we were used to having to react quickly to his alarm barks. My mom and I were the first into the hallway, and we raced down the steps and ran into the living room to make sure the cats were fine. Jack was tricky and had gotten out of his crate before. The thing is, everything was fine. No cats around, nothing. My mom let Jack out of his cage. He bolted to the glass door and started going crazy. My mom and I kind of just both looked at each other, thinking the dog was weird. So we flipped on the patio light and looked outside. Nothing was there. We decided not to let the dog out, in case we couldn't get him back in. So my mom turned off the light and closed the blind and brought Jack back to bed. The next day, my sister and I were coming up the driveway when we saw our mom walking up the hill in our backyard from chatting with our backyard neighbor. She had a very concerned look on her face. When we asked her what was wrong, she told us our neighbor tool shed had been broken into. Our neighbor was a young, well-to-do handy father that had a bunch of really nice tools and hardware equipment, but he said it was weird. The only thing he was missing was a screwdriver. And then he mentioned that my friend Ashley's family, who lived 2 doors from him, also had an incident last night. So, my mom went in and called her mom. As my mom talked to my friend's mom on the phone, I threw some clothes on into the dryer and started working on my homework in the living room. When my mom hung up the phone, she was so pale and she looked right at me. I asked her what was wrong. My mom proceeded to tell me that last night my friend's mom and younger brother had happened to fall asleep in their basement watching a movie. At about 1:30 a.m., she woke up to scraping and shuffling outside their glass walkout. Her mom ran up and woke up her husband to go check it out. He tried to brush her off, but he humored her. My friend's dad happened to be a supervisor at Chrysler, and always had to keep his phone on him, even when he was sleeping. As he pulled open their blinds and turned on the lights, he was face to face with a very large man. My friend's dad was able to call the police from his cell phone, but they later found out their phone lines were cut, and their upstairs glass doors had been tampered with. The police didn't show up for another half hour, but they did bring a canine unit. The dogs were able to track the man's scent to the dirt road, but they ultimately ended up losing him. As my mom finished telling me this, the dryer exhaust kicked on. And when it does this, the vent is right near the big sliding glass doors in the living room, and the glass fogs up. As the glass fogs, my eyes go directly to a massive handprint that was near the handle. It was positioned only in a way that if you were trying to force the door open. My mom quit talking, and all of a sudden, my family was just staring at this handprint. We all looked at our hands. It was bigger than mine, bigger than my mom's, bigger than my sister's, and also bigger than my dad's. We reported our experience of the night to the police, and they came back to check out and take pictures of the handprint. They never ended up finding the guy, but the police had some suspicions. My sister, Ashley's 2 sisters, and I were all runners and frequently ran around our subdivision along the dirt roads. The open layout of our subdivision would enable somebody to observe our habits from afar without even knowing they were there. After some quick realizations that this guy didn't attempt to break into the tool shed's neighbor's house and wasn't after expensive equipment, he didn't try to break into the house with a giant Rottweiler, but seemed to be targeting houses with young high school girls, well, we all came to the same conclusion. Jack, without a doubt, saved us from something potentially horrible that night. Number 6. A few years ago when I still lived in upstate New York, something really scared me. If you've ever been to upstate New York during the winters, well, you know that it snows here a lot. I usually just spend snowy nights watching TV. I lived about a mile or so from any other house, and my roommate was out at the moment. Now, I'll be honest, being alone made me feel uncomfortable. I've always had an overreactive imagination, and small noise really scares me. Like I was saying, my roommate was out at the time. It was snowing heavily. It was probably like 9 or 10 at night, and I was watching TV like normal. All of a sudden, I heard a crunch outside, like somebody stepping on ice. I immediately tensed up, and my mind raced to every possibility. It wasn't my roommate, since I didn't hear a car. I listened in horror, as I could hear the crunches getting louder. I ran into my room and locked the door. I grabbed my baseball bat and grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, just in case. I know it might seem like I was overreacting, but remember, this is at night, heavy snow, and miles away from any other house. Who could possibly be outside? The footsteps just stopped at some point. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up, my roommate was back. I went outside to see if I could find any evidence of what was outside. What I found still haunts me to this day. I saw footprints in the snow coming out of the woods and circling around my house. The footprints were filled in for the most part, so it was hard to figure out where they were going. The scariest part of all of this is that the footprints stopped outside my bedroom window. The other footprints were filled in, but they were fresh, as if someone had been standing there all night, since the snow stopped early in the morning. To this day, it still scares me. I don't know what kind of person would be out in those woods. The fact that while I was in my room, they were standing outside my window still scares me right now. Needless to say, I moved out of the house a few months later. Number 7. Living on the streets of New York City, you definitely meet a fair share of weirdos. Being a bit strange myself, the average people don't bother me too much, but every once in a while, somebody comes along and really scares you. It was last summer, and I was just hanging around Union Square. No one was really outside, except save a few college kids and the usual home bums. That's when I saw him, a man with no shirt or shoes, carrying a rusty broom handle walking along the path in my direction. Just how he was walking gave me a weird vibe, from the clink of the broom on every other step, to the way he seemed to wave his arms in a swooping motion. He was around 50 feet away when he noticed me, and made direct eye contact with me.
"You!"
the man exclaimed as he came running up to me. "Yeah?" I responded as he stood right in front of me, panting, with pupils as big as his eyes themselves.
"I've already banished you from here. How dare you come back, Mark?"
At this point, as you can imagine, I was really confused. I had a lot to drink that night, and this guy was obviously on some sort of psychedelics. "Whoa, dude, relax. I think you got the wrong guy. My name's Joe,"
"Prove it."
he says. As I go to reach for my ID, he promptly begins to scream again.
"Never mind. I know your tricks. You are Mark, and you must be stopped."
He then starts screaming random sounds and noises while beating that rusty broom handle on the ground right in front of me. Needless to say, I grabbed my backpack, hopped on my skateboard, and tried to get away from this guy. But as soon as I started my getaway, he was on my heels, chasing me.
"Mark,
It was telling me as he charged after me down Broadway.
be gone."
I skated 10 blocks before he stopped chasing me, and didn't stop until I made it another 20. I never met that guy again, nor do I want to. Ironically, I've been confused for somebody else, but that's a story for another time. Number 8. To clarify, I'm a half-Asian female living in the UK, and the events that took place happened when I was 16 to 18 years old. I was on my way to my boyfriend's house at the time, which took about 2 hours to travel, as I live around 20 miles away from the city that he lives in, which is Bradford. Between his work and my college timetable, it meant that I'd have to get ready to go see him after college, and therefore, I ended up having to travel late at night just to get to his house. I also want to mention, I feel partly responsible for what happened on the first night, as it being exclusively me traveling to meet him meant that I was fairly used to strangers making idle chat at bus stations by this point. So, I initially wasn't too wary of the situation. Like any other weekend, when I journeyed to Bradford, it was already nighttime, and I was waiting for the last bus that from the bus station takes about 20 minutes. The bay for the bus I was getting was full of people, so I sat at the next bay, which was empty. I was on my phone texting him to keep him updated where I was, and that the bus should arrive in about 5 minutes. That's when a guy came up and sat right next to me. This man was probably in his early 20s and wasn't much taller than me. I'm 5'4" and was wearing a black hoodie and jeans. The following conversation is what basically was said between us from what I can remember.
"Hey there. So, are you from around here?"
"Oh, no, I'm not. I've just come from Wakefield."
"Oh, well, that must have been a long bus ride. What's your name, beautiful?"
To which I told him, and bear in mind that my name is a little odd, so it didn't surprise me when he replied with,
"That's a beautiful name. What's your last name?"
Regrettably, I had told him my surname. At this point, he got out his phone, messed with it a little bit, and showed me the screen. The guy quickly searched me on Facebook and brought up my profile page. And of course, before I could respond, he followed with,
"It looks like you. I'm gonna add you now. Do you have a boyfriend by any chance?"
Yeah, I do. In fact, I'm on my way to see him now." And what this absolute creep said next was when things started to get worse.
Well, do you want two boyfriends? The other doesn't have to know. I could always take better care of you.
All the alarm bells were kicking off inside of me. I told him no, and that I definitely was not interested, but he kept persisting that I give him a chance. As I was about to get up and move somewhere else, the bus had arrived. Thank goodness, I thought to myself. But this guy just wouldn't give up. When I got into line behind the other commuters, he pushed in to stand right behind me. As I boarded the bus, I ran straight to the back of the bus and tried to hide from him. I looked up to see where he was, and he was at the front of the bus, talking to the bus driver, who didn't sound very happy. He then walked over to the back where I was and sat next to me.
I don't have money. Could you maybe give me some bus money? I told the bus driver you would.
He leaned in to try to kiss me and hold my hand, so I moved myself away from him, only for him to start stroking my legs. I was just frozen in place, shaking and on the verge of crying, and not knowing what to do. I was going through all the possibilities of what could have happened next if this guy could have tried to follow me. The bus hadn't left yet, and out of nowhere, he got up again and went to talk to the driver. There were a group of middle-aged men and women who sat right in front of me, and I attempted to get their attention to tell them what was happening. I was going to tell them that I didn't know this man and that he was following me and acted in very inappropriate ways. But I felt if I tried to talk, I wouldn't stop crying and not even be able to speak coherently. But thank goodness by some miracle, after from what sounded like the driver raising his voice, the creeper got off the bus and kept walking. When I finally got to my boyfriend's house, I couldn't stop crying for hours. I remember this man had me on Facebook and proceeded to block him. I never did go around to reporting him to anybody because I just felt so defeated and that it could be implemented that it was my fault for engaging with him. And once my boyfriend's mom found out, she insisted on driving me to the bus station to make sure I was okay when it came time to leave. We broke up a month or so later for unrelated reasons, and I thought that was the end of that. Well, fast forward a year later. We ended up getting back together at around the same time we started dating. One day on the way home from my now ex's boyfriend's house, it was mid-afternoon, and I had just arrived at Bradford's bus station. There was still 20 minutes to wait, so I went outside and waited for the bus to come. I was listening to music through my earphones, and halfway through waiting, I hear to the side of me a girl's voice, sounding very distressed through my earphones. I took them out and looked over to my right side, and on the other side of the doors, in the smoking area, was a young woman also smoking, and a young man a little taller than me, wearing a blue checkered dress shirt, sitting uncomfortably close to this girl, who was slowly back-pacing away from him. His hands were raised slightly, almost trying to get her around her waist. I wasn't too sure at first, but at the same time, I wanted to be on the safe side and just kept watching them. Both of them had noticed me staring, and the girl kept smoking while the guy stared back. The girl finished her cigarette and sped off. She walked back inside past this dude, who was now focused on me. I finished standing there shortly after, and I lost sight of the girl in the bus station. So, after I sat back down at the bay, I hadn't noticed the guy trailing behind me, until of course, he slowly walked up to me. With the better lighting from inside the bus station now, it was obvious. It was the same guy from a year ago, standing adjacent to me. To this day, I don't know if he recognized me or not, but he quietly asked me,
Hey, where are you from?
Feeling all the rage and humiliation coming back to me, I looked this guy in the eye and very bluntly told him to go away. This time, the bus station was more full than before. I was sitting next to a few commuters, so this guy, probably not wanting to cause a scene, backed off and walked away. Or so I thought. When I eventually got onto the bus, I decided to get on top of the deck for whatever reason, and as I sat down, I noticed something that made my spine chill. This creep hadn't walked away like I thought. He was actually standing right behind the timetable board, right on the bay where I was sitting, and he was watching me. He was just staring at me the whole time, as the bus continued to reverse and back out of the station. Again, I never managed to report him because he technically hadn't done anything to me like the last time. And again, I broke it off for good with my boyfriend during these events shortly after. Also, I've never needed to or had reason to travel to Bradford since. What still bothers me to this day is that from the first encounter with the creep, I just thought he was messed up in the head or something. But my gut feeling tells me that the last time I saw him, he must have been harassing that girl, because she noped out of there really quickly. So I seriously doubt she knew him. I did try to find out who he was by checking my block list, so I could at least make a Facebook post about him and warn my fellow friends. But seeing as he was literally the only person I had blocked, his profile wasn't on there anymore, I assume he must have deleted his account. Number 9. This takes place about a couple of weeks ago, I think. You see, here in the middle of Tennessee, we get one of the worst storms we've had in a while. There's debris everywhere, power lines down, and lots of closed roads. Our house was thankfully untouched, but our power was out for the night and the following 2 days. It just so happens my parents are going to be gone all day for the first day. They went to Kentucky for a Pink Floyd concert. Also, my brother would be gone all night thanks to work. So, the day goes by relatively fine. I'm bored obviously, and it's super hot. I've got my phone though, and I'm texting my boyfriend all day to keep me company. It's getting pretty late by the time my phone hits 15%, and it's about 9 p.m. I don't want to lose my only communication device left, so I need to charge it. I'm just so lucky that the only way to charge my phone is to take a charger box, plug it into a car, and sit out there in the dark while it charges. So that's what I do. I take the charge box and my phone charger and my phone and even my dog with me, and I head for our broken down rendezvous. Now I'm thankfully lucky that the car doesn't actually have to be running in order to charge my phone. So I let my dog go into the back seat and plug everything up. I play with the dog and talk to my boyfriend and lock the doors completely. You see, I'm very nervous, of course, as it's pitch black everywhere and it's all thanks to the power outage. Thankfully though, it's a pretty quiet area. For an hour and then some, everything is fine. Until of course I see something in the backyard. My view of the backyard is small, as it's obscured by the garage. It's an extensive backyard, with about an acre past the fence in the back, but I can see the flashlight beams coming over the back of my house. I, of course, reasonably begin to panic. Not only is somebody in my backyard, but they undoubtedly came from the back. If they passed by my house to the right, I would see them. If they passed to the left, my dogs would see them and bark. Well, the flashlight continues for about 10 seconds or so, and then it turns off. At this point, I'm just hoping they just left. Another 10 seconds of fright pass by, and King starts growling next to me. I'm now in the back seat with him hiding to try to conceal my presence. Another 2 seconds passes, and all of my dogs in the house start going crazy. Looking back, I probably should have gotten my dogs out so they could have gone and chased the trespasser, but I was frozen. Eventually, they all calmed down. At this point though, I'm extremely scared, as all is quiet, so they are still back there. I immediately call my uncle, and he checks and sees nothing. I go back inside the house, gather some things, and spend a couple of hours at my uncle's apartment before my brother comes to pick me up. Now, I've tried to rationalize this. For instance, I've called the power company earlier and given them my address. But why would they not park in the driveway if it was them? And why wouldn't our dogs acknowledge them too? Our dogs are very touchy and bark at anything within a 5-mile radius. The only explanation that I truly have is that somebody malicious was in our backyard and then proceeded to get scared by the 7 dogs there. Honestly, I'm pretty chill now. I'm just hoping they don't come back with friends. Number 10. One summer when I was, I don't know, around 16 or 17, I went with a few girlfriends to Venice Beach. It's nearby and a fun place to just hang out, even as broke teens. I mean, people watching is free. So is flirting with the boys. That day, I met an older boy, and he was hanging out by himself with a book. Yeah, I know, a book. Well, he was just sitting in the sun alone, reading and looking like a beautiful angel. I kid you not, this boy was absolutely stunning, even by Hollywood standards. One of the friends I was with said she thought he looked like one of her boyfriend's friends, so I approached him with that. We talked for a while, although he didn't really say much. We exchanged numbers, and shortly after, my friends and I left. The next day he called me and asked to take me out. Now, I was just a teen, so most boys I was ever interested in either didn't have a car, none of them read for pleasure, and they were not nearly as stunning as he was. So although I just met him, I agreed to go out with him that evening. He picked me up in a huge new-looking truck, and before I could even ask where we were going, he said he needed to stop at a friend's house to pick something up. This was all the while he was still rather quiet. It was just like at the beach, but now he was smiling more and seemed to be more at ease. He drove about 5 or so minutes and stopped in front of a house. He then parked and went inside while I waited inside the car. It was my choice, by the way. Now, I've never been a snooper, even when I'm really into someone. And even though I was attracted to this guy, I wasn't really into him yet, since I barely knew him, but the thing is, something told me to look into the glove compartment. I did so, and in it, right on top of everything, was a black ski mask. In case you didn't know, Los Angeles doesn't get ski mask weather, and underneath that was a large knife. The handle had masking tape wrapped around it. It was sticking out from under the ski mask. I immediately closed the glove box, and right at that moment, I noticed thick brown rope on the floorboard by my feet. I hadn't noticed the rope when I got in because, number one, I had first date jitters, and number two, I'm short, and this was a huge truck, so sitting all the way back in the seat, my feet hardly touched the floor anyway. Just then, it was like a horror movie. He comes strolling back to the truck with something wrapped in newspaper. He gets in, and as calmly as possible, I ask him where he's taking me for our first date, since he never mentioned it on the phone. Also, he never mentioned it on the short ride to my friend's house. And of course he says, I kid you not, something like,
Oh, have you ever driven until you got lost? Well, I was thinking we could do that. It'd be a lot of fun.
That was it for me. I agreed, but I feigned being sick and even managed to gag and retch as if I was ready to vomit. It wasn't hard to do since I was actually sick with fever. He took me home right away since at that point, we were still not far from my house. But this whole thing transpired within 30 minutes of him picking me up. After that, I never answered his calls again. Not that he was persistent. I mean, I'm sure he had plenty of other girls as a backup plan, but for that night, thankfully he never followed up. A few months to a year later, I can't really recall, my friend whose boyfriend was, as it turns out, casual friends with him, told me he is now serving a life sentence. Regardless, it seems we will never be meeting again, and that's a good thing. Number 11. So, this is not my first time being followed on a drive home late at night, but it was more upsetting than the other times. Backstory. I recently, at the time, this was a few months ago, moved from a very populated area near Los Angeles to a very small rural town in Oregon. I think it was less than 5,000 people. I'd spent time up here over the summer, but moved back to California to finish school, and back to Oregon to work. At the time of this encounter, I'd been up here for literally about 3 days. This was in the middle of January. It was around 1 in the morning. Okay, end of background. So, I was driving from the main big city around here, back home at around 1 in the morning, along a 1 or 2 lane highway. After leaving the city, about a mile down the highway, I realized the car behind me was fairly close. I thought maybe he wanted to pass me or something like that. I was passing another car, so I was in the left lane. I went to the right lane, and so did this other car. After another mile or two, I noticed he was further back, but going the exact same speed as I was. As I said earlier, I had been followed home before, and this was a decently new area. Plus, I was a young female, 20 years old, so I'm not really a kid or anything. And I was driving alone at 1 in the morning in a relatively unpopulated area. I spent the next few miles constantly checking my rearview mirror and making sure my phone was unlocked right next to me. I got into a left lane, thinking maybe they wanted me to get out of their way so they could go faster without me having to change lanes. Well, they didn't move. They just stayed at my speed. I know going the same speed on the highway isn't that weird, but it was for me. If I was going 45 miles an hour, they were going 45 miles an hour. When I'd speed up to 60, they'd speed up to 60. Now, I should probably mention, the speed limit here was 55. After getting almost to the last town before several empty miles of 1 lane in each direction, I decided if they stayed where they were, I'd call the police and ask for help because I felt unsafe. Meanwhile, I was still in the left lane, and they were in the right lane. I know, left lane is for passing, yada yada, but this was 1:15 in the morning. We were literally the only 2 cars on that part of the highway. I'd seen maybe 4 or 5 cars, but that was 10 miles ago. About a mile before the first exit to the last town, I noticed they backed off, but then suddenly they were hauling to catch up to me, and using the middle of both lanes. I started to get scared and grabbed my phone. and that's when the blue and white lights started flashing from behind the car. I switched to the right lane and slowed down to 45. I put my blinker on and took the off-ramp. I made a right turn at the end of the ramp and pulled over. I put the dome light on inside the car and rolled the window down, scared out of my mind. A cop came up to me and said he pulled me over for a suspected DUI because I had been swerving a bit. I stared at him and went off on a rant about how I was not drunk, nor high, and I explained to him that I was 20 years old. I had literally moved to the area 3 days before. I had been followed while driving late at night several times, including one time on my own street. I was bordering crying at that point, and I said that I was about to call 911 when I saw this car behind me heading right towards me in the middle of nowhere. I told him that he made me so scared, and that's why I was swerving. Not because I was drinking, but because I wanted to keep an eye on a larger vehicle that might have been following me. During my rant at him, I never yelled or raised my voice. I simply stared him in the eye and spoke everything in a very matter-of-fact voice. The entire time, I saw his face go from professional to a more understanding look of, "Oh, oops," and he apologized and brought my license to his car. That's when his partner brought it back and apologized again, and they let me go. Now, did I do some things I shouldn't have? Absolutely. I shouldn't have pulled over. I should have called the cops sooner. Probably a few other things as well. But I don't regret any of it. From that moment on, I keep my phone unlocked and right next to me in the car, just in case. So to the guy that followed me on this deserted highway, let's never meet again. Number 12. A little backstory before I begin. My grandfather passed away when I was just a little boy. Left his hundreds of acres of forest to my grandmother. I can't remember much around his passing, but I do know that my grandmother hated and still hates being alone. After my grandfather passed, my grandma got my aunt, my uncle, and my 2 cousins to move back in. Seeing as she was alone on hundreds of acres of forest with nothing but her best friend, Shamrock. Yeah, I know, we're Irish. My family's extremely close, so we always went over to enjoy my grandma's property, about 5 days a week. A couple of years of spending time there, an incident occurred. When I was 8 years old, I got my dog, Sheba. Sheba loved going to my grandma's house and running freely in the forest with Shamrock. They always came back home, thankfully. I would often join them, making an adventure out of it. In this forest, there was quite a few amount of oddities. There was a half-built house, some tractors, and a few trucks. They were all from the 80s. My grandfather always half-completed projects, and then would start new ones. It would just be a huge cluster of things in the forest. This, of course, was the perfect harbor for weird people. A few times, I've come across some weird people trekking on my grandma's land. And for some reason, I was extremely brave, and had no problem telling them to get out of here. Probably because I had 2 gigantic, imposing dogs. These people would often oblige because I was holding 2 dogs who were going absolutely crazy. Come to think of it, I have no idea how I managed to hold these 2 beasts back. But yeah, normally people would be instantly scared and would turn back around the way they came. That was of course until one day, when I was the one that turned around. I was hanging out at my grandma's one day during the summer, pretending to be a video game character from one of my favorite games. That's when the dogs began to scamper off into the woods. I was so excited to go. I was an agile kid, so I had no problem keeping up with the dogs. But before I knew it, we were deep into the woods. I had no idea where I was. I wanted to go back home, with the dogs being my only way to navigate back home. I began to say to my dogs, "Come on, Shams, Grandma has food for you," which usually worked, but these 2 were bent on running about. I, of course, was hopeless. I had no choice but to follow them. I did for the next 10 minutes, hoping to find an abandoned tractor, the half-built house, or something that I could identify. Well, nothing. And then to my delight, came a clearing. I ran towards it with the dogs trailing behind me. When I got to the clearing, I saw nothing I remembered, but there was a pile of rocks, or boulders rather, at one side of the grassy hill. I remember my father telling me about how the half-built house was originally intended for my family to live in, but that idea was scrapped. So I assumed this pile of boulders was going to be used to build the house. I began looking, climbing and examining the rocks. That's when I saw it, a red car door at one side of the rocks. I heard a grunt, and that's when the dog's ears perked up. As I told you before, for some reason I was ridiculously fearless, so I investigated. The car door was bright red. large, and had no windshield, so it stuck out like a sore thumb. Well, needless to say, I peered through the door. All went silent. I heard breathing. Then he spoke.
Leave.
He grunted. And that's just what I did. I darted out of there, incoherently screaming to myself. I don't know how, but I ran onto the beaten path that led to the wooden fence that bordered my grandma's immediate backyard. The path that led to her house was just indented tire tracks and matted grass from years of my grandpa driving to the forest. So, the path, so to speak, was not clear by any means. Being an average 8-year-old, I was really bad at tying my shoes, so when I clipped a rock, my shoe came flying off. I halted and turned around to pick it up and continue on. That's when I saw him. I could see the grassy hill from where I was, and somehow I never noticed it in my years of being there, but it certainly stuck out to me now. This ragged figure appeared at the top of the hill. He was in a dirty light brown coat, with jeans and what appeared to be no shoes. I picked my things up and legged it again. My grandma and mom were on the porch, which was at the side of the house. It was closest to me. It was on the top of the side garage, so of course, it was massive. They saw me coming and began waving. I'm guessing they didn't see the figure on the hill. It was obstructed by trees from their angle. Also, they were seeing how hysterical I was. The dogs made it to the patio stairs first, followed by me. I began to explain to them what happened. Me being lost, the man, him speaking to me, etc. They didn't take it lightly, but seeing as my grandma deals with coyotes, wolves, bears, the whole 9 yards invading her property, she wasn't exactly afraid of some nomad in the rocks. However, my dad eventually went over there to check it out when he ended up arriving home from work. But of course, the guy had left. There were signs he was there, but nothing was left behind. Well, we thought it was over, until a week or so later. My grandma just bought my mom a new van, and seeing as how my grandma had a massive driveway, we left our old hunk of junk parked there. One day when my grandma is out running errands, she returns to my mom's old car sitting at the end of the long lane, and her house broken into. She immediately called my dad over, as well as the police. My dad wouldn't share details with me, seeing as I was just a kid. But one day when I was on the computer, I stumbled upon the entire report my dad had typed up. Obviously, of course, I read it. There was also a photocopy my dad had saved of the police report. The report, plus my dad's account, went roughly as follows. A homeless man, who was shortly after apprehended, had broken into my grandma's house, stealing only a few items of jewelry, a jar change and food, all while leaving bare, muddy footprints all about the house. He then proceeded to steal my mom's old car and drive it to the end of the laneway before leaving and wandering off. They ended up arresting him actually after leaving the scene of the crime, because he was still walking up my grandma's street. Her street would take a 45-minute walk to get off of. Apparently, this dude decided to basically give up and wait for the police. The case itself isn't that creepy. A homeless guy breaking into a house, but what sealed it for me was the muddy footprints. I had seen a barefoot homeless guy just about a week prior, lurking about around my grandma's house. To think he was basically watching them and possibly entering their house at night scared me senseless. It's just creepy to think that this guy was just waiting for us. Number 13. This happened to me a few years back. I live in a suburban neighborhood that borders a large park, part of which is public and the rest is closed off of a reservoir. The public section of the park is sprawling over several acres. There are hiking trails in the woods, a baseball field, basketball and tennis courts, and a playground area. The park is accessible by car, via a winding one-lane road that goes through the playground area and around to more remote sections in the woods. Eventually, this road leads out to a major, busy highway. At one point, it was used as a cut-through to get from the highway to my neighborhood and beyond. Nowadays, there are several larger access points to the neighborhood, and the cut-through is seldom used. My story begins on a late winter afternoon. I was spending the night with my now ex-husband, who is an avid runner. He decided to go on foot into the park to take a run down the one-lane road. He did this often, and the crime rate in this area is extremely low, so I thought nothing of it. After about an hour or so, he comes back all sweaty. I asked him how the run went, his time per mile, all that kind of stuff. He tells me it was slower than usual that day, and just wasn't feeling very well during the run. As he's heading to shower to rinse off, he casually says, "Oh, that's right, I should tell you. I heard this dog whimpering in the woods, right when I was running." Now, I asked him for more specifics. He said he had not gone to look for the whimpering dog because the noise had stopped shortly after it started. He then said the last thing we need is another pet, and went off to shower. I sat there for a bit, looking at my 3 dogs laying on the floor and lazily pawing at each other. After a few moments, I couldn't stand it anymore, so I laced up some tennis shoes, grabbed some treats, and headed to my car. My husband was just getting out of the shower by then, and I told him I was going to go look for the dog. He said I was crazy, but didn't try to stop me, nor did he want to go back out with me. By now, daylight was fast fading. It was close to 5:30 p.m. The spot he'd heard the whimpering was about 2 minutes from our house. I drove over and pulled my car into the shoulder, so as to not block the lane. I got out and started calling for the dog. I wanted to see if I'd start hearing the whimpering again, or it would come to greet me. I heard nothing. So after a minute or so, I decided to venture out into the woods. The woods in this area of the park are not too dense. You see, there's trees spaced at least 8 to 10 feet apart, and the forest floor was blanketed with fallen leaves. Every step I made was a loud crunch. I'd stop, call out, and be still for a bit, then slowly move further into the woods. I thought I could hear a dog whimper once or twice, but it always happened as I was calling out, so I couldn't be sure. The further I walked, the less light there was, and the more dense the trees became. I had brought my cell phone, but this one didn't have a flashlight. I'd been out there walking, calling, and stopping for about 20 minutes. That's when I came upon a small clearing. Now, I've always been fascinated by scary things, but all the stories I've read before would not prepare me for what I was seeing in that clearing. The first thing that caught my eye was this formation of sticks laid out on the ground. The sticks were all the same size and formed a small circle. Inside the circle, there were 3 more sticks propped up in a tripod formation. On top of the tripod was a small doll's head, with the eyes missing from their sockets. So I eventually had this realization where I thought to myself, well, I'm alone in the woods, have no form of protection on me. Oh, and that's right, I'm clearly in a place I'm not meant to be. I froze in place as I surveyed the surroundings. To make myself less scared, I called it again softly this time. "Come here, puppy." There were small bones in a pile at the far edge of the clearing. A bush to my left clearly had several more eyedol heads hanging from the branches. Now, it wasn't windy that night, but I swear I heard the rustling of leaves the last time I called out for the lost dog. As I scanned the perimeter from left to right, my eyes suddenly fixed for a split second across the clearing on something in the trees. There, about 8 to 10 feet back in the bushes, was a man's face. I kept my eyes moving because something told me not to let him know I'd seen him. The brief moment I glanced at him was enough to momentarily paralyze me. His hair, it was long and unkempt. And his eyes, don't even get me started with those. It looked like they were bulging out of his head. To be honest, I couldn't really see the rest of him, as he was hiding behind a tree. At this point, my flight response finally kicked in, and I was able to move again. I remember saying something to the effect of, "Silly dog, you must have found your way home or something." And that's when I started back out of the clearing, still scanning. He didn't appear to be pursuing me. So as soon as I was half hidden behind the trees on my side, I took off running at full speed to my car. I couldn't tell how long it took or how far it was, but daylight was all but gone by now. I somehow made it back to the road, a few yards behind where my car was parked. I sprinted to it and locked myself inside. It took me 4 attempts to get my key in the ignition with how badly my hands were trembling. I finally got the car started and got out of there right away. I took the long way home to my house by going out to the main highway and entering my neighborhood through another well-traveled intersection. As soon as I was home, I called the police to report what I'd seen. They never did follow up with what I saw. The more I've thought on this over the years, I'm convinced the man in the woods was the one whimpering. And if it was, I hope I never meet him again. Number 14. I'm a 44-year-old male, and this took place when I was 18 years old. After this event, I still can't drive down back roads. I was driving in the deep south down a lonely stretch of road, heading to see family. Now, I'm from Canada and only knew this way of getting there. I was currently in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi, and it was 1 in the morning. While driving, I could hear the sound of somebody yelling. I know I shouldn't have, but I pulled over. I thought maybe somebody needed help. Well, I had a big mag light in the trunk of my car. Now I should point out that this car was my first car, and it was pretty much junk. I called out into the darkness and said, "Hello? Is somebody there?" I got no response, just eerie silence. I heard something in the distance though. It sounded like somebody trying to sneak around without detection. I heard a slight, somewhat distant snap of a twig, followed by the sound of a voice.
"What are y'all doing in my part of the woods? Nobody goes in my part of the woods."
I nearly peed myself. I started to sweat from fear. Come on, man, don't hurt me. I just thought somebody needed help."
"Come here, son. I can't have anybody seeing what I'm doing."
I ran around the front of my car and hopped in the driver's seat, mag light still in hand. I turned the key, only for the car to sputter and not turn on. "Oh, come on. Turn on. Come on, not now." Well, I turned the key again, hearing the car choked alive. I put it in drive and floored it out of there. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my worst nightmare. My heart started to race and skip beats as I saw headlights coming up fast. My car can only go about 80 miles an hour flat. I came upon a bend, and given the quality of my car, I had to slow down. As I braked, I felt a bump from behind. The vehicle behind me was clearly a truck, but I couldn't make out the driver, due to the headlights and the height of the truck. We rounded the bend and I put the pedal back down all the way. I heard the car's engine struggle to pick up revs. Slowly, the car crept up to 80, all the while the truck kept mere inches from my bumper. Now at this point, I knew I was coming to an intersection, so I decided I would try and shake the truck. We got to the intersection and I faked a turn. It worked initially, but as I slowly sped up from the fake turn, the truck swerved violently and started following very close again. The car struggled to go at 80 miles again as I looked in the mirror again and the headlights were there. I felt another bigger bump as the truck rammed me again. The car swerved slightly, but I corrected it with my adrenaline-fueled strength. I then heard the truck rev up, readying for another ram. I swerved over to the opposite lane, and the truck nearly lost control as it followed me behind. Just then, I saw a road coming off. With the truck having fell so far back, I made my turn. I turned the car lights off and spun the car around, watching the road ahead. Sure enough, a big pickup truck roared past, and I waited a good half hour before continuing on. I called the cops when I got into my family's house, but all they found was an abandoned house. Everything in the house was normal except for one thing: a picture of my car. I've never taken a back road since. I saw what I think was the same truck a few weeks later, in a gas station in Alabama. I've since bought a new car, and I've only visited that part of my family once since then. Number 15. A little backstory. When I was 19, I lived with my mom in a ranch-style house, and a road that backed up to a large field. On the other side was the main highway. About half a mile down from me was a lonely farmer. About a mile on the other side was, well, pretty much a crack house. I guess somebody used to live there, but it was run down. Other than that, those two houses were very isolated. At the time, I was working full-time and going to school full-time too. One of my classes ended at around 10:30 p.m. I often wouldn't get home that day of the week until about 11:15. I was driving home one night, and I noticed some guy walking down the road. He had a yellow shirt and track pants. It wasn't weird to see people walking down my road because of the whole abandoned houses thing, but I instinctively looked over at him when I drove past. He turned and smiled and waved, which scared me. So, I speed the half-mile home and pull into the driveway, weirded out. I made sure all the doors and windows were secure, and then sat on the couch to be a paranoid freak, and wait to make sure the dude walked past my house. Except, he didn't. And there was another guy with him, dressed in darker clothes. They actually walked up my driveway and started playing around with my car, testing the handles and stuff. In my hurry, I forgot to grab my phone from my car, so I was kind of worried that's what they were after, until the guy in yellow started approaching my door. I'm scared, so I go and wake up my mom. She's barely getting up, I'm trying to explain the situation. That's when we both hear the doorknob turn very slowly. Good thing it was actually deadbolted. She got out of bed, walked to the door, and then the yellow shirt knocked. I perched up on the couch so I could get a good look at him and his friend, and they were still in the driveway. The porch light was on because of the sensor. "Yeah?" my mom said.
You dropped your wallet.
I told my mom I had my wallet with me, and that it was in my purse. She calmly told him that she had her wallet with her. It was too late to be knocking on people's doors. I remember perfectly what he said next, even though this was about 6 years ago.
All right. I'm not a bad guy, just so you know.
We were all pretty still. No one moved, not even the guy at the door, not even when the porch light went off. Then he tried the handle again. My mom told me to call the cops, so she could go get her weapon. That's when I told her I didn't have my phone with me. She then proceeded to walk to the kitchen to grab hers from the charger. She handed me the phone and walked to the bathroom. She stared out the window into the backyard and then went into her room. I was talking to the cops and explaining the situation, all while watching the two guys. I was explaining that there were two suspicious guys at our door, and that's when my mom came back and said, "Went in her backyard too," which explained why she had looked out the bathroom window. She saw him from the kitchen and went to get a more discreet look. My mom walked over back to the door and loudly said, "If he tries the handle again, I'm going to open fire." I don't even want to know why she said that, instead of waiting for one of the cops to arrive, but the guys took off down the road. I told her and she rushed to the bathroom, where the guy apparently in the backyard saw his friends running down the road and sprinted off too. The cops searched her house and her yard and went to the house, where they found 5 dudes hanging around. One was the yellow shirt guy, and assuming his friends were with him as well. They did get arrested, and nothing weird like that ever happened again. The only problem was I was still on edge for a while. I make sure the doors are locked at all times, every single day, even though I live in a much nicer area now. I just wanted to go ahead and say thank you so much to all the Patreons who donated this past month. Thank you so much for donating, guys. And for those of you guys who do donate, you guys get some pretty awesome cool perks and rewards, like getting my videos way earlier than everybody else, getting my autograph, and even getting a personal handwritten letter from myself. So if you haven't checked out my Patreon or haven't donated, then make sure you guys do, as like I said, I've got some pretty cool rewards and perks for you guys that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Other than that, guys, thank you very much.